The trucks started lining up before the sun cleared the tree line. Trevon Ashby stood at the greenhouse door with a clipboard in one hand and a paper cup of coffee going cold in the other. Inside, the benches were full of trays, and every tray had a name written on a wooden stake pushed into the soil. A man in a feed cap leaned out his truck window and called across the gravel, "You got any pepper starts left?" Trevon checked the whiteboard, nailed to the greenhouse frame, without needing to look twice. "Next open batch is Thursday." The man nodded like he expected that answer, because by now most of the county did. 3 years earlier, nobody would have believed this greenhouse could hold anything worth reserving in advance. 3 years earlier, it was the joke of a Saturday cleanup sale outside a nursery that was going out of business. High Ridge Nursery sat off Route 9 on the edge of town, in the kind of North Carolina Piedmont country where red clay soil met pine thickets and the growing season decided everything. Trevon had worked there on and off since he was 16, hauling bags of potting mix and watering benches of annuals for spending money. When the owner, an older man named Gene Pruitt, decided to retire and shut the place down, he put everything up for sale in one long Saturday auction. Pots went first, then hoses and carts, then a stack of old wooden benches nobody haggled over. Behind the main building, past the gravel lot, sat a greenhouse that had not been used in almost 4 years. Its plastic covering had torn loose in long strips that flapped whenever the wind picked up. Weeds had grown up through cracks in the concrete floor, thick enough to hide the drainage channels. 2 of the metal hoops that formed the frame had bent outward, pulling the whole structure slightly out of square. The irrigation lines inside were clogged with algae and dead leaves, and the fan at the far end had not turned in years. Gene walked a few interested buyers back to look at it, and every single one of them shook their head and walked away. "Whoever takes this has to tear it down themselves," Gene said to the small group standing near the door. "That's labor most folks don't want for free, let alone pay for." An older farmer named Dale Whitfield laughed and spit into the weeds. $25 for that? He said it like a joke, and a few people around him chuckled along. "You paying for the plastic or the holes?" Someone else added that whoever bought it should bring a trailer, a torch, and a lot of patience. Trevon stood near the back of the small crowd, half listening, half thinking about the van his mother used to run her roadside vegetable stand. The van's transmission had been slipping for 2 months, and the mechanic in town wanted more money than they had sitting around. His mother, Delphine, sold tomatoes, squash, and greens out of that van from a folding table near the highway from May through October. It was not much, but it kept the lights on, and lately it had been running on fumes and hope. Trevon had picked up seasonal work wherever he could find it, at High Ridge, at a neighbor's tobacco barn, and helping a local market gardener named Odell Faison start his spring trays. He understood plants the way a person understands them from doing the work, not from a textbook. He knew when a tomato seedling was stretching too tall because the light was weak. He knew when a tray had been watered too much because the soil smelled sour instead of earthy. He was not a scientist, but his hands knew the rhythm of spring, planting the way his mother's hands knew the rhythm of a roadside stand. When the bidding on the greenhouse opened at $25, nobody raised a card. Gene looked around the small crowd and shrugged. "Anybody?" Trevon lifted his hand before he had fully decided to. The crowd turned to look at him, and a few people smiled the way people smile at something they find a little foolish. "You serious?" Dale asked. $25, Trevon said, and Gene brought the gavel down before anyone could talk him out of it. Dale shook his head and clapped Trevon on the shoulder on his way past. "Well, good luck tearing that thing apart, son." Trevon paid the $25 in cash and stood alone at the greenhouse door once the crowd had moved on to the next lot. Up close, it looked worse than it had from a distance. The plastic sheeting hung in ribbons, and one of the 2 doors had come off its hinge entirely. Rust had eaten through several of the bolts holding the frame together, and a few of them crumbled when he touched them. He told himself it was just $25, and that whatever happened next, he had not lost much. That feeling lasted until the first weekend he tried to take the structure apart. His cousin Marquise came out with him on a Saturday with a borrowed flatbed trailer and 2 sets of ratchet straps. The first bolt they tried to loosen sheared clean off, and it took them an hour to figure out they would need an angle grinder for half the joints. Some of the hoops were too long to fit on the trailer hole, which meant cutting sections and marking them so they could be reassembled later. The old plastic tore apart in their hands as they pulled it down, and it filled 2 truck beds with torn sheeting that had to be hauled to the dump. By the 3rd weekend, Trevon had spent almost $400 on a grinder blade, new straps, a tank of gas for 2 trips to the landfill, and a case of replacement bolts. His mother watched him unload another truckload of bent metal into the side yard and crossed her arms. "That thing was supposed to be $25, she said. "It was," Trevon said. "$25 for the metal," Delphine said. "Now you're paying for it twice." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he kept working. By the time the frame was fully relocated to a cleared patch of ground behind their house, he had spent close to $600 total, more than 20 times what he had paid for the greenhouse itself. His mother's brother, Uncle Ferris, stopped by one evening and looked at the pile of bent hoops leaning against the shed. "You know they sell brand new greenhouse kits for not that much more," he said. "I know," Trevon said. "So why not just save up and buy one that works?" Trevon didn't have a full answer for that either, not yet, only a feeling that the used frame had potential if he could figure out what to grow in it and how to make the math work. He spent 2 more weekends straightening the hoops he could save and cutting loose the ones that were too far gone to fix. He bolted new joints where the old ones had failed, and he leveled a section of ground with gravel and landscape fabric to keep the weeds from coming back through the floor. New plastic sheeting cost more than he expected, but he found a roll of 6-meal greenhouse film on sale from a farm supply store 2 towns over. He repaired one door and left the other propped shut with a 2x4 until he could afford new hinge hardware. He cleared out the old irrigation lines, replaced the ones that had cracked, and got a small circulation fan running off an extension cord from the shed. It took him almost 6 weeks of evenings and weekends before the greenhouse held heat and looked, from the outside, like a structure someone actually intended to use. His first plan, the plan he had carried in his head since the day he bought it, was to grow vegetables himself and sell them at his mother's stand alongside her produce. He started trays of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, picturing baskets of ripe fruit lined up under the roadside canopy by early summer. For a few weeks it felt like it might work, and the seedlings grew well under the repaired plastic. But when he sat down and actually worked out the numbers, the plan started to fall apart in front of him. The greenhouse was barely 18 feet by 30, which was not enough growing space to produce vegetables in the volume that would justify the heating bill. Heating even that small space through cool spring nights was already costing more electricity than he had budgeted. He still needed field space to actually mature the plants to harvest, since the greenhouse alone could not carry full-grown tomato vines to fruit, and even if he got a full crop, he would be selling into the same roadside market as his mother and 6 other small growers in the county who already had bigger fields and established customers. Odell Faison, the market gardener he sometimes worked for, put it to him plainly one afternoon while they were unloading trays at Odell's place. "You're fighting people who've been doing this 20 years on land 10 times the size of yours," Odell said. "That's not a fight you win on price." Trevon ran a small trial anyway, selling a portion of his tomato harvest that summer at his mother's. It wasn't a disaster. The tomatoes sold fine and people liked them, but after he counted the hours, the electricity, the water, and the seed cost against what he actually earned, the profit was barely worth the trouble. The greenhouse, he realized, was never going to make him a serious vegetable grower. It was too small, and the math simply did not favor him. He almost decided the whole thing had been a $600 mistake, dressed up as a $25 bargain. Then, one afternoon at Odell's place, he overheard something that changed the direction of everything. Odell was on the phone with another local grower, a woman named Patrice Kilgore, who ran a small produce operation 2 farms over. "I need 600 tomato starts, ready the 2nd week of May," Patrice was saying, loud enough that Trevon could hear her through the receiver. "Not before, not after. My crew's already scheduled to go in the ground that week." Odell told her he might be able to help, but couldn't promise the exact date, since his own seedlings were behind schedule that year. When he hung up, he rubbed his forehead and told Trevon that half his calls in April were exactly like that. Everybody wants plants, Odell said. Nobody wants to grow the first 6 weeks themselves anymore. Too much risk that early in the season. Trevon asked what he meant by risk. Odell explained that starting seed outdoors in early spring was a gamble, since a cold snap could wipe out a whole planting overnight, and greenhouse space to protect seedlings was expensive to build and heat. Buying seedlings shipped in from bigger nurseries had its own problems, since plants arrived stressed from the trip, sometimes too early or too late for the actual planting window, and custom variety requests were hard to place in small quantities. Farmers don't want tomatoes from me in July, Odell said. They want healthy plants in their hands the exact week they're ready to put them in the ground. That sentence sat with Trevon the whole drive home. He thought about his greenhouse, too small to grow a season's worth of vegetables, but plenty large enough to protect a few thousand young seedlings through the riskiest weeks of their life. He didn't need to grow the whole crop. He only needed to grow the hardest part of it, the part where a cold night or bad timing could ruin everything, and hand off healthy, well-timed plants once that risk had passed. The greenhouse's real value was never going to be volume. It was control, over temperature, over timing, over the handful of weeks when a seedling was most fragile. He drove straight to Patrice Kilgore's place before he could talk himself out of it. She looked skeptical when he introduced himself as Delphine's son from the vegetable stand, and even more skeptical when he told her about the greenhouse. "You're telling me you want to grow my transplants," she said, "in that little frame behind your mama's house. 300 tomato starts," Trevon said. "You give me the variety and the date you need them, I'll have them ready." Patrice crossed her arms and studied him for a long moment. "If they're not ready when you say they'll be ready, that's my whole planting schedule thrown off." "I understand. Do you?" Trevon nodded slowly. "You supply the variety list, the count, and the target date," he said. "I grow to that schedule. You pay per tray." She agreed to a small trial batch, 300 plants of a variety called Better Boy, ready by the first week of May. It was a modest order, but it was real money attached to a real deadline, and Trevon treated it like the most important contract of his life. He sowed the seed on a schedule he worked out by counting backward from the planting date, subtracting the weeks a tomato seedling needed to reach transplant size. The first batch did not go perfectly. Germination came in uneven across one bench, since the heating mat he was using did not distribute warmth evenly across the whole tray. A section near the prop-shut door stayed cooler than the rest of the greenhouse and slowed the seedlings there down by several days. He called an extension agent listed in a farm bulletin his mother kept in a kitchen drawer, and the woman on the phone walked him through checking his soil moisture and spacing the trays for better airflow. He adjusted the bench layout, moved the mat, and fixed the second door properly instead of relying on a 2x4. By the target date, the plants were healthy, uniform, and exactly the age Patrice had asked for. He labeled each tray with her name and the variety before loading them onto a borrowed trailer. When he delivered them, Patrice walked the rows slowly, checking stem thickness and leaf color the way someone checks produce at a market. "These are good," she said finally. "Real good." She placed a second order before he left her driveway that day, this time for peppers as well as tomatoes, and asked if he could hold space for her again the following spring. Word moved through the county the way it always did, farmer to farmer, at the feed store and at church and at the auction barn. By the next planting season, Trevon had 4 regular customers instead of 1, each with their own variety list, their own count, and their own date. He started keeping a simple calendar taped to the greenhouse wall, working backward from each customer's planting date to figure out exactly when he needed to sow their seed. He learned that tomatoes, peppers, brassicas, and cucumbers did not all move at the same pace, and he grouped his benches loosely by how each crop handled cold and how long each one needed before it was ready to leave the greenhouse. He was not running a science lab, just paying attention the way he always had, only now with real money and real deadlines riding on it. As demand grew, farmers stopped simply asking if he had extra plants and started asking to reserve space ahead of time. By his second full season, Trevon had shifted from selling whatever he happened to have to selling production slots weeks and sometimes months in advance. He kept a small notebook, then later a whiteboard nailed inside the greenhouse door, listing whose trays were whose, what variety, what sow date, and what pickup date. It felt for the first time like a real business instead of a hobby that happened to bring in a little cash. That confidence was exactly what got him into trouble. Late that second spring, with orders piling up from 6 different growers who all wanted plants ready within the same narrow week, Trevon did not want to turn anyone away. He knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that his bench space and his single small heater were already stretched thin. But every farmer who called sounded a little more desperate than the last, and he told himself he could make it work if he just packed the trays a little closer together. He shifted some of the younger, more fragile seedlings into a cooler corner near the repaired door to make room for the rest. A cold front moved through on a night nobody had forecast clearly, and the temperature inside the greenhouse dropped further than his small heater could recover from. It never reached freezing inside, but it stayed well below what the youngest seedlings needed to keep growing steadily. By morning, an entire bench of pepper starts had stalled, their growth uneven, some leaves curled and pale where the cold had stressed them. Several hundred seedlings across 2 customer orders were not going to be ready by the promised pickup date, and there was no way to speed them back up in time. Patrice was among the growers affected, and she was not shy about her frustration. "I've got a planting crew scheduled for Saturday," she told him over the phone, her voice tight. "Not next week, Saturday." Another customer, a younger farmer named Cassius Dupree, said flatly that his whole spring schedule was now off because of Trevon's mistake. Trevon did not argue or make excuses. He drove to 2 nurseries outside the county on his own dime and bought replacement transplants at retail price to cover what he could not deliver on time. He refunded a portion of the contract price to both affected growers. Even though it ate into money he badly needed for the van repair his mother still hadn't been able to afford. Cassius did not place another order with him that season, and it took months before he trusted Trevon's schedule again. Trevon sat on the tailgate of his truck the night after the failed delivery and thought about what had actually gone wrong. It wasn't that the greenhouse was too small. It was that he had been counting capacity by how many trays could physically fit on a bench instead of by how much heat, airflow, and attention each batch actually needed to stay on schedule. A greenhouse full of trays wasn't the same as a greenhouse full of trays that were all going to be ready on time. Production capacity, he realized, had to be measured in weeks and degrees, not just square footage. He rebuilt his system from scratch that summer, before the next planting season could catch him unprepared again. He mapped every bench on a sheet of plywood, marking exactly how many trays each section could hold without crowding airflow. He set a maximum number of new sowings per week, based on what his 1 heater and 1 fan could actually maintain, even on a bad night. He color-coded tags for each customer, 1 color per grower, so a glance at any tray told him whose plants they were and when they needed to leave. He built in buffer space, deliberately leaving a few trays worth of room empty each week instead of booking every inch of bench to capacity. He stopped accepting new contracts once a week's slots were full, even when a caller sounded disappointed. It cost him a little short-term revenue, but it meant every customer whose name went on a stake in the soil could actually count on that date. Trust came back slowly, the way it always does after it's been damaged, 1 clean, on-time delivery at a time. By the spring of his 3rd year, Trevon's whiteboard was full most weeks, before the season had even properly started. That was the spring the frost came. The forecast had called for a mild final cold snap, nothing unusual for early April in that part of the Piedmont. Most local growers had already moved a portion of their tomatoes and peppers outdoors, either into the field under thin row cover or into unheated hoop tunnels that offered only modest protection. The forecast shifted overnight, and temperatures dropped several degrees lower and lasted several hours longer than anyone along the county roads had prepared for. By morning, fields up and down the highway showed the damage. Rows of transplants sat blackened and limp where the cold had gotten to them, and growers who had gambled on an early start lost a meaningful share of their first planting. Trevon's phone started ringing before he had finished his morning walkthrough of the greenhouse. Farmers who had never called him before were asking if he had extra trays. describing losses in their fields in a tone that had none of the skepticism from that first auction morning. Inside his greenhouse, the benches were untouched, green and steady, exactly as they had been the day before, because every tray in that structure had spent its most fragile weeks protected on purpose. It wasn't luck that kept them alive. It was the same heater, the same fan, the same bench map and sewing calendar he had built after the failure 2 years earlier, doing exactly what they were designed to do. He walked the rows that morning, checking each stake, and every single tray still had a name on it, a variety, and a pickup date that had not changed because of the frost. Those commitments came first. When new calls came in asking for emergency plants, he checked his board honestly with each caller. To most, he had to say the truth, that every tray currently growing already belonged to someone. Those trays already have names on them, he told one caller, a man he didn't recognize from 3 farms over. He did have a small amount of true surplus, extra seed he had started as backup in case of exactly this kind of loss, and he sold that surplus at his normal contract price, not a cent more, to the growers who needed it most urgently. He turned away more callers than he was able to help, and it bothered him, but he did not cancel a single existing order to chase the higher demand. Word of that spread almost as fast as word of the frost itself. Dale Whitfield, the same farmer who had laughed at the $25 bid 3 years earlier, pulled his truck into the gravel drive 2 days after the frost. He walked up slowly, taking in the greenhouse, the repaired plastic, the rows of green trays visible through the door. "You growing tomatoes now?" he asked. "Not tomatoes," Trevon said. "Then what?" "Starts." Dale looked at the whiteboard over Trevon's shoulder, at the neat rows of customer names and dates. "You got any pepper starts left?" Trevon checked the board the way he checked it for everyone. "Next open batch is Thursday." Dale nodded, and for the first time since that auction morning, there was nothing close to a laugh in his face. He put his name on the Thursday list and drove off without another word about the $25. That season, with demand higher than his single greenhouse could meet, Trevon finally started thinking seriously about expansion, but only because the first structure had proven itself reliable, not because of one good frost. He went to the credit union in town that summer, the same one his mother banked with, and asked about a small loan for a second heater and a partial second bay. The loan officer was cautious. At first, the way lenders tend to be with a young man and an unconventional business built out of a greenhouse he'd bought for $25. Trevon came back a second time with a folder instead of just a request, showing 2 years of customer contracts, sewing calendars, deposit records, and the bench map he used to track capacity. The numbers were modest but consistent, and the repeat customer names told their own story better than he could have explained it. The credit union approved a small equipment loan, enough for a second heater and materials to extend the existing frame rather than build an entirely new structure from scratch. He added a second bay slowly over the following off-season, using lessons from the first build to do it faster and cleaner the second time. By his 4th spring, Trevon had between 20 and 25 regular growers, reserving production slots months ahead of planting season, along with a rotating handful of smaller one-time orders. He brought on a helper 2 days a week, a high school junior named Caden who lived down the road and wanted to learn the trade the way Trevon once had at High Ridge. His mother started keeping the pickup records in a notebook she kept next to her stand ledger. Since the 2 businesses had started sharing customers and, some weeks, sharing the same folding table, his younger sister took to helping label trays on weekends, writing customer names in careful block letters that Trevon said were neater than his own. The van finally got its transmission replaced that year, paid for out-of-contract deposits instead of a loan. Revenue by the 4th season had climbed to somewhere between $280,000 and $350,000 a year, built on real volume, thousands of seedlings moving through several planting cycles across 2 greenhouse bays, not on any single lucky event. That number looked impressive on paper, and Trevon was careful never to let it sit there unexplained. It was never all profit, and Trevon knew that better than anyone, since seed, growing media, trays, plastic, heat, electricity, water, labor, and the occasional replacement batch all took their share before anything counted as his. But the business held together, season after season, because it was built on something steadier than luck. It was built on farmers, knowing that when their name went on a stake in Trevon's greenhouse, the plant attached to it would be ready, healthy, and correctly labeled on the exact date they needed it. That was the whole business, really, distilled down to one plain fact. A greenhouse that grew good plants was common enough in that part of the county. A greenhouse that grew good plants on time every time was not. On the evening after that spring's last big pickup, Trevon walked the rows one final time before closing up. The last truck pulled out of the gravel drive with its bed full of tomato and pepper flats, taillights disappearing down the road toward the highway. Inside, every remaining tray still had a stake pushed into the soil, a name, a variety, and a pickup date not yet arrived. He checked tomorrow's sewing sheet against the bench map one more time, the way he did every night, out of habit more than necessity now. Off to the side of the greenhouse, half buried in weeds near the shed, one bent and rusted hoop section still leaned against the wall, left over from that first dismantling 3 years earlier. He had never gotten around to hauling it off, and by now he wasn't sure he wanted to. Trevon reached up and turned off the work light, and the greenhouse went dark except for the faint glow of the heater indicator near the door. Somewhere in a drawer inside the house, the original auction receipt still sat folded, next to his mother's stand ledger, the number 25 written on it in Jean Pruitt's own handwriting. He locked the door behind him and walked back toward the house, already thinking about Thursday's batch.